Welcome to the AI Chat Podcast. I'm your host, Jaden Schaefer. Today on the podcast, we have the pleasure of being joined with Avi Gesser, who is the co-chair of the Data Strategy and Security Group at the international law firm of Debevoise Plimpton. His practice focuses on advising major companies on a wide range of cybersecurity, privacy, and artificial intelligence matters. And he has represented global financial service firms, private equity firms, insurance companies, hedge funds, tech companies, and media organizations on navigating the legal risks associated with the adoption of artificial intelligence. We are super excited to have you on the show today. Welcome, Avi.
Hey, thanks for having me. Big fan of the podcast, so it's great to be here.
Okay, well, we're thrilled to have you on. What I really want to kick this off and ask you a little bit about is your background and your journey. You know, right now you're obviously advising a lot of different organizations and companies on what's happening in AI today. Was this an area of law that you kind of always knew you wanted to go into? Tell us a little bit about your journey, what brought you here today. Have you ever wanted to start your own podcast? I record and publish podcasts on a platform called Spotify for Podcasters, and I absolutely love it. Essentially, you can upload from your phone or computer, and it distributes to every platform that plays podcasts. They support video podcasts, and you can make money on the platform with ads or even podcast subscriptions, something that has made my life so much easier as a podcaster. So if you're interested, I highly recommend you give it a try. You can download the Spotify for Podcast app, or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started on your podcast today.
I have a science background, and so I've always been doing sort of tech-related issues in law. And about 10 years ago, when I returned to private practice after working in the Department of Justice, I thought that cyber was going to be a big issue for our clients and focused a lot on cybersecurity. And through that, we started to see maybe about 5 years ago that there was a lot of cyber risk associated with AI adoption, and that we thought that focusing on AI as a cyber issue was going to be really important. And then as we got into that, we realized cyber is one aspect of AI risk, but there's a lot of other aspects of AI risk and privacy and bias and quality control and other things. And so we just branched out from cyber into AI, and now AI has become a very important part of our practice. We also have a cyber and privacy practice, and we think those three go together, and that's what we call our data strategy and security practices, pulls all three of them together for a sort of overall data management type practice.
Yeah, and I think that's very smart of you, obviously. So critical today to really, I think, put those together. The privacy aspect, the security aspect, all of this is super important and critical in what's happening in AI, or else you're going to end up on the wrong side of the regulators and everything in that regard. And speaking of which, we recently had all of this kind of news come out in regards to an AI executive order that came out from the White House. I'm wondering if you've had time to kind of look at what's going on with this executive order. If you could give everyone kind of an overview of, I guess, some of your key takeaways from this executive order.
Sure. And it has been really interesting. I spent a lot of time yesterday pouring through it, and I think it shows a very thoughtful, very measured, quite sophisticated approach by the Biden administration. I have to say I was very impressed with the order. It, I think, recognizes that there's an enormous potential for use of AI, and that there are a ton of opportunities for a lot of benefits for the federal government, for the private sector, for individuals, but that, harnessing responsibly the use of AI is going to take a lot of work, and that the federal government can lead in that by first as a user of AI, setting standards, and that each agency within the federal government has a responsibility to provide guidance for the entities that it regulates, because those particular agencies are going to be best suited to figure out what particular risks are posed by the adoption of AI in that sector. And so I think it's a very smart thing to recognize that, the risks for mortgages is very different than the risks for pharma, which is very different than the risks for consumer lending, which is going to be very different for the entertainment industry, and that you're going to need. I know everyone wants to have a very sort of comprehensive AI regulation like the EU Act because it's simple to do that. AI isn't like cyber. Cyber is pretty much the same for everybody, right? Like AI is extremely context specific. And so it depends on the industry. It depends on the use case. And so to get this right, unfortunately, you're going to have sort of piecemeal regulation that's going to go and identify the risks that are really specific to that industry, to that use case. And this recognizes it. But it also, I think, does a very good job for the foundational models, for the one of the biggest risks that people are concerned about is, just the risk that these models are going to be misused. It does, I think, start with a very practical approach, which is the foundation model providers and developers need to be disclosing their red team testing, their vulnerabilities, and then based on that, then the federal government may decide to do something else. It may have a licensing regime or may limit the distribution of certain models and so forth. But it starts with, I think, a very important premise that this is inevitable. AI is not going away. And there's a lot of upside, but we really need to be quite careful about how we're using it, and this is going to be a partnership between the private sector and the public sector.
Yeah, no, and I think you're spot on. Something you said struck me as interesting about it kind of being in the right direction. I naturally am a little bit pessimistic of all kind of like regulation from the government in relation to AI, and maybe that's just because what I work on and where I sit and stuff. But I was actually pleasantly surprised, honestly, by this executive order. And some of the things that were in there, and I felt like there was really kind of, a lot of this was really moving us in the right direction. Something I would love to ask you about, because I know it has gotten a little bit of criticism in some regards for this, so I'd love to get your take on it. Some people have said the executive order essentially is a little bit too much what feels like, best practices or guidelines and not really like clamping down or setting like firm, hard rules. Like we see countries like China that have like, set essentially like hard rules on what data can go into an AI model to be trained with and that kind of stuff. Where do you kind of see it playing out there? Do you think they're taking the right approach in this regard? I'm sure there's like arguments on both sides of this. I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, I think it's too early to tell. I mean, we'll see. A bunch of federal agencies are now required within a relatively short period of time to come up with guidance for their particular sector. And some of those agencies may provide quite strict rules. But it makes sense to the extent that there are rules that they're not necessarily applying to everyone because not everyone has the same concerns, right? So like, for example, what you're really concerned about is bias in the use of AI because your training sets may not be representative and so forth. Well, that may be something that you really need to be worried about in consumer lending or insurance or hiring, but it may not be something you really need to worry about in certain other areas where sort of AI for cybersecurity or other use cases where that's not really a concern. And so I think the approach of dividing AI into sort of pieces and trying to tackle the problems, at a sector specific level, I think is going to give you prescriptive and clear rules where they're needed, but not necessarily where they're not needed. That's the hope. But I think it's a little too early to tell. Okay.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Something that I've also heard talked a lot about, and I'd love to get your perspective on from basically what you're seeing. There's some language in this executive order that seems to kind of address the type of AI model. And some people are talking about, the differences between how this relates to what's, a foundational model or something by OpenAI or Microsoft or Google versus a kind of a smaller AI company. based off of what you're seeing, how does this executive order apply? Or is it different? Are there kind of different segments for bigger versus smaller companies? Or does this apply to pretty much all AI companies across the board in the same way?
So the actual, I mean, I've looked at the actual executive order, which just was released sort of late in the day yesterday. It has very specific definitions for which models, get covered. I think it's got like a 10 billion parameter threshold, and there's some other thresholds, but it's very specific as to which models are covered in the sort of definition of dual use models that the rules apply to.
Okay. And what do you think, let's say over the next year, what do you think the biggest implications or shifts that we'll see in the AI landscape, maybe self-regulating or maybe enforced? What do you think the biggest changes will be because of this executive order and kind of this direction?
So I think what we're going to see in the private sector is a recognition that regulation in some form is coming, that and even if it's not coming, that the regulators are going to take their existing toolkit and start applying it to AI. And so they don't necessarily need new rules for, if you're using AI in a way that's deceptive, right? So there's lots of ways to combat fraud. And there's already lots of privacy laws and lots of cybersecurity laws and lots of laws about anti-discrimination, right? So in some places, there'll be regulation to fill the gaps, but there's already, quite significant regulation that could be applied to AI. And I think people recognize that that's coming. And so I think you're going to see companies in preparation for that really sort of building out their own AI governance and compliance in some ways in a self-regulatory way, like just not necessarily waiting for exact guidance, because that's going to be a long process. It's going to take some time. And I think if you're adopting AI now, it's probably easier to start building the governance and adopting and sort of iterating and getting better than sort of adopting AI, waiting for the guidance from the regulators, then trying to create the governance on top of something that's already, in flight. And it may take, more time than the regulators give you to come into compliance. Again, like AI isn't like cyber in the sense that like for cyber, for governance, right, you'll have like a chief information security officer, and your tech the tech group inside the company like has a natural place where a lot of that sits. AI it's everywhere. It's all throughout the organization. It's in customer service, it's in HR, it's in the business, legal, compliance, risk. Everyone's got a role. So building out a real compliance structure and governance around it is like a real change management issue. And so it's going to take time. And I think companies are going to want to start doing that, soon.
Okay. Yeah, I really think it's something that if companies aren't already thinking about it, they really got to get started. I think this executive order was kind of like the flag in the ground that says, okay, like if you're not already there, like get on it, because this is obviously very important and applicable to the industry. You've been consulting and working in kind of this legal space for a while here. Something I'd love to ask you about is, what are some of the biggest challenges you face in, or your clients are facing right now in this whole AI space and the regulation and the legal aspect of everything going on here?
I think one of the hardest things that companies are facing is separating high value, low risk use cases from low value, high risk use cases. And it sounds easy to do. It's really hard to do, partly because there's so many risks that it's hard to assess. I've listed a bunch of them, right? So there's privacy, there's bias, there's explainability, there's transparency, there's, IP risks. But, not every use case has got all those risks. And so to be able to say, okay, for this particular use case, the risk we're really focused on is bias or cyber or whatever it is. And then we've got the right person in the organization who's going to say, okay, considering the upside, that risk is acceptable or it's not acceptable. And here's how we're going to mitigate that risk. Like that's just a hard thing to do. And I think a lot of companies, have all sorts of really good ideas, and will spend, a fair bit of time trying to develop them, and then realize somewhere down the road that they've got some roadblock that really doesn't make it worthwhile from an operational point of view, from a legal point of view, from a reputational risk point of view, whatever it is, and then they feel like they wasted a lot of time, or it just the generative AI just didn't provide them the value that they thought it would, or the error rate made it really hard to operationalize, or the uncertainty of the model. And so, being able to fail fast and figure out which use cases aren't worth pursuing, that's, I think, a very tough challenge. And the solution, I think, is to have a committee that's just becomes really good at evaluating use cases and figuring out which ones are worth spending time on and which aren't. There's no substitute for just rolling up your sleeves and just looking at use cases. And the more you look at them, the better you get at identifying the risks.
Yeah, I think that's so critical. That's some incredible advice. Listen, as we wrap up the podcast today, the last thing I would love to ask you about is, what is one piece of advice you feel like you could give to companies today that are looking at implementing these AI features, looking at doing stuff? I know, you just gave your advice on looking at what the most low risk, high reward things are, and seeing the difference there. What's perhaps another piece of advice you feel like you could give companies today that you think is important for them to focus on?
So this is just my own experience. I think if you're doing something pretty well already, then I wouldn't necessarily be looking to have generative AI do it for you a little bit quicker, right? I would be looking for things that you're not doing because it's just too hard. It's going to require too much time, and the generative AI would be able to do something either 100 times faster than you could do it, just because it's such a huge volume set, or it's just something you would never do. We are seeing people saying, well, we think the generative AI could do this quicker, and maybe it can, but it often comes at a cost. And the cost may be a quality control issue. It may be a loss of skills issue. It may just be workplace disruption issue, loss of job stuff, which can create all sorts of turmoil within your organization. And I think it's a lot easier to find and to get people really excited about use cases where we say, hey, look, this is something we always wished we could do. We were never able to do it because it would take just too much work. And now all of a sudden we have an opportunity to do it. I think it's a lot easier for people to get behind those kinds of use cases.
I love it. That is some incredible advice. I think that's super applicable. Thank you so much for coming on the AI Chat podcast today, sharing your insights, sharing what you're seeing in the industry. I will leave links in the description to your firm if people want to get in contact with you and find out more about what you guys are working on. And to the listener, thank you so much for tuning in to the AI Chat podcast. Make sure to rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and have a fantastic rest of your day.